It's our pleasure to have Nancy Rodriguez today. And Nancy is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder, in the US. Her primary focus lies in utilizing mathematical modeling, numerical analysis, and mathematical analysis to study the intricacies of social, biological, and ecological systems. Her contributions have expanded the theoretical understanding of non-local PDs and have yielded insights into crime dynamics and prevention, social segregation, and pest control. Today, she's going to talk about online to offline spillovers, epidemic and reaction diffusion approaches. So Nancy, thank you again for having accepted the invitation, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to share some of this work today with you. If you have any questions, so I can't see the chat, so please just feel to interrupt me. I have no agenda, so I welcome questions throughout the talk. So today I'm going to talk about sort of online to offline spillovers and a couple of frameworks that we can use to study the spread of different activities online and offline. Of course, I should have gone ahead. I can't seem to move forward. Oh, there we go. I'll use my mouse. So really the motivating questions for us were, how do protests spread in the age of social media? And let me move this so that you don't see it. And how do really, in particular, how do social networks influence protest dynamics, right? The reality is that these days, more than 2/3 of the world population use social media. And so as a consequence, right, this use has increased the spread of information, but also misinformation. And so consequently, it has fundamentally changed when, where, and how conflicts occur in general, right? Whether it be riots, protests, or, wars, for example. So how social media has reshaped the protesting landscape, of course, leads to some benefits, right? In general, there's more mobilization and organization that's available. There's increased awareness and visibility of a particular topic. Another benefit could be the decentralization of leadership, and there's some protests that have really taken advantage of this. Another benefit, of course, is that you can have a very localized movement that grows to garner national and international support. And so social media can really help sustain a movement. Of course, there are also drawbacks, right? In some countries, we have seen sort of government surveillance. There's also the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Another drawback, of course, is, which we'll, try to incorporate into our model, is the superficial clicktivism, the fact that you're online, maybe tweeting about something makes you feel like, okay, you've done enough, and it doesn't necessarily turn into an offline activity. And just as, social media can help sustain a movement, it can also lead to like movement fatigue. So before I, get into the modeling, let me just introduce and talk about a few real world examples where we know social media has played a key role. So we'll talk about, the Arab Springs, which of course we know started by the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in protest of government corruption in Tunisia. And so local activists there shared videos of the incident on Facebook and Twitter, which of course sparked outrage. But through hashtags like, at January 25 in Egypt and hashtag Arab Springs, this connected activists across countries, and so led to a movement that in the end overthrew the government of Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. There's, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013, which was sparked by the acquittal of George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin's shooter in 2013. And so then activist Alicia Garza posted on Facebook, leading to the creation of hashtag Black Lives Matter. After the shooting of Michael Brown in 2014, this movement exploded nationally and actually internationally, and it's still a movement that is present today. right? Thanks to social media keeping this movement sort of alive. And just a couple more examples. The Hong Kong protest of 2019, 2020 really started with a small number of activists opposing an extradition bill in 2019, and really was the use of Telegram and Reddit-like platforms that were used to organize leaderless protests, right? So in this case, we have a decentralization of leaders. So this prevented the government cracking down on single organizers. So again, it started out with a sit-in at the government headquarters. So it's very small, and social media helped it grow from a small protest to more than 1 million. And finally, let me just mention the Me Too movement, which again was coined, this term was coined by Tarana Burke to support survivors of sexual violence. And in 2017, actress Alicia Molino tweeted, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too," as a reply to the tweet. So immediately over 12 million people engaged with that hashtag, right? And it led to legal actions and major workplace changes. So these, for examples, are situations where, again, these initial events, right, are very localized, and social media has helped sort of grow and sustain the movement. So the picture that I want you to have in mind, and sort of the picture that motivates the type of frameworks that we want to develop and study, is sort of people engaging online. So we have this sort of online world or information world where people are connected across, you know, geographical locations through maybe a variety of social fields. And there could be basically explicit or implicit call to action that leads to some offline activity. Which of course there's news, media, or even people posting videos of what's happening offline that can loop back into this online engagement. And so I'm focusing on protesting activity, but the offline activity really could be boycotts. It could be domestic violence, which we have seen has increased in many countries, and a lot due to what's happening online. It could be hate crimes, where again, we know in these three situations, the online world has a huge effect on what's happening offline. And so we have this general O2O spillover and cycle where they feed back into each other. So from the modeling perspective, we focus on two frameworks. And so I'm first going to talk about this epidemiological approach, which we are all familiar from modeling COVID, or seeing models of COVID dynamics, right? These are compartmental models where theory has been generalized to include networks. And let me just say that the first time this approach really was used to model riots was back in 1979 by Birbeck. And then, it doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it is, in 2018, we kind of generalized this perspective, this model, to introduce spatial dynamics and the effect of space to try to understand the 2005 French riots. Since then, our framework has been generalized to look at other protests, such as the Chilean riot of 2019, and it has been generalized to incorporate things like, for example, the train system in Santiago, for example. So I'm going to talk about this perspective, and in essence, we're going to be generalizing this framework to be able to model these, the incorporation of networks. There's also the reaction-diffusion approach, which we know are used to model general phenomena. And so there's been a huge theory developed for these models. A benefit of studying reaction-diffusion models is that we can study traveling wave solutions, which in some situation, in some protest, as I'll discuss, actually are seen in the data. And so with Beresticky and Nadal, we developed a model that now we want to try to generalize to networks. And of course, other people have developed also reaction diffusion models to model this type of activity. So let me start off with the epidemiological approach. When in theory, you can have sort of a multi-layer network, right? We're living in sort of an online world and an offline world. And for now, we're going to focus simply on one network. And the physical layer we're not going to keep track of where people are doing the offline activity. At the moment, you can incorporate that, but I'm just going to talk about what happens when you just have sort of one network. So imagine that in the information layer, there's a particular topic, and so you have people that are either uninterested in a topic. There are people who are engaged in the topic, or people who are disengaged. And so if you are unengaged and in your network people are engaged, there's some sort of contagion rate. There's some based on a transmission rate called tau, and that's tau. This is a transmission rate per neighbor who is actually engaged. And then eventually there could be sort of, fatigue, movement fatigue, and so people become disengaged. How do we connect the online, the information layer, and the physical layer? Is that, some people practice clicktivism. A fraction of them will actually do something offline and protest or do some offline activity with some transmission rate eta, okay? And then, but what happens offline, again, feeds back into the information layer, and that's going to be through this parameter theta. So this is the model that we have in mind. There are some assumptions that we made, and of course you can generalize the model, but the framework itself, I think could be generalized to many other models, which then if you have data, you can use model selection to figure out what's best. So we have this compartmental model, which we can view, of course, as a stochastic Markov process where we only have 5 states. And the way we can view these states is really each state has an information layer and then a physical layer. The NP is not protesting, which is kind of like the standard, everybody's assumed to be initially non-protesting. And then we move stochastically through these states. So you can become engaged and not protesting. A fraction will actually protest and then eventually recover. Or if you're just practicing clicktivism, you just engage online and eventually disengage from the topic. And so we actually have exact dynamics, exact differential equations for the expected value of the number of individuals in each of the states based on the expected number of y neighbors of all x's, for example. And so here's our online system. Here's our offline system of 5 equations because we have our 5 states. So let me just, for fun, show you sort of the dynamics in a simple network. Imagine online, you have these 5 people who are engaged. Eventually, they, other people become engaged online. There, on the offline world, there's a delay. And eventually, red people are protesting, and eventually people recover, and sort of kind of at this point, the movement is over. So that's just a toy example of what the dynamics look like. Our goal, of course, is to approximate this UE term in the model to capture the network topology, ensuring that's sort of good enough to achieve relatively accurate proportions without excessive computational cost, using mean field approximation according to the network type. And so, of course, if, we are all familiar, if we have a network that's fully connected, we can just make the assumption that the average engaged individual has approximately, a fraction of the total unengaged divided by n uninterested neighbors. And so you can close that system this way. So let me just show you sort of the simple assumption. Okay, what if we're in a fully connected network? This is the model that we have. And I'm just showing you here a couple of sample dynamics of the system. The key things to look at are the red and purple curves. That's sort of the engaged online and engaged offline. You can see here the delay between the online and offline. And in the first situation, there's more online activity than offline activity. But there are situations here in the bottom where, in fact, there's more offline activity because the recovery rate offline happens to be lower. So there's some situations that there are more people that are protesting than actually engaged online. Okay, so that's just the fully connected network, but we want to incorporate network structure. And so we first look at what happens when you have a homogeneous graph. So assume I have a k-regular graph so that every node has n neighbor or k neighbors, well, you could do various approximations, right? You can close the system similar to how we closed it for the fully connected graph, and we get a very similar system of 5 equations, except now we have the number of neighbors, the degree, the degree of the node appear. Or we can actually look at the evolution of the edges and close using the triples, and the price that we pay is just having a couple of more equations, right? And so we can close these triplets of a variety of ways. But let me just show you sort of what we get. So which system is better? Which approximation is better? Depending on the situation that we have. So here we're taking just a k-regular networks. Here's what we have for the online engagement. This is an average degree of 5. The Gillespie is a stochastic simulation, so we're taking that to be our ground truth for our Markov process. And the red is the single level approximation. The green is the pairwise approximation. You can see it is definitely much better than the single level approximation. As we increase n, right? So n is, in this case, is 5,000. That's the number of nodes that we have. The approximation doesn't change, just the envelope of Gillespie gets tighter. And the same thing for n is 10,000. So the pairwise seems to be a spot-on match in these circumstances. For the offline activity, and this is something we see across the board, actually the single level approximation is not as good as the pairwise, but it's still, it's better than for the online engagement. And so this is what we observe as we increase n. So overall, we have a couple more equations, but we've gained a lot of accuracy by using the pairwise approximation. So because we really have been incorporating more of the network structure in our model. So if we look at the errors as a function, let's say, of the average degree, what we see is that for networks that are not dense, the pairwise approximation definitely does better. And as k increases, the single approximation improves significantly. So especially online, you can see that eventually, after about 25 offline, the L2 error of the pairwise and the single level are about the same. Now, what about as a function of the size of the network? As a function of the size of the network, the L2 the pairwise approximation definitely does much better, okay? There's not much improvement. As n increases, we're sort of 1 over n approaches 0, and the error doesn't really decrease that much. So as a function of n, the pairwise approximation is definitely always a better method to use. So really the takeaway is that if you have a large enough network for that are, that it's a low dense network, then you should use a pairwise approximation. But if k is bigger than about 25, a single level approximation is fine. So that's for homogeneous networks. What about for heterogeneous networks, right? In reality, most networks are heterogeneous. So in this case, now what we want to do is we want to keep track of not just the number of people in each state, but the number of people in each state with a given degree. So let's, you don't have to pay attention to all these terms, but let's say the maximum degree of the network is k, right? Then we're now going to keep track of the number of individuals in state U of degree 1, 2, 3, all the way through k, for example. And we want to develop approximations for the dynamics for networks such as the Erdős-Rényi random network, power law networks, bimodal networks. Power law networks are particularly important because they do appear a lot in the real world. And of course, we want to test on real world networks. So let me just say that, of course, the single level approximation, gets a little bit more complicated. But again, I'm not incorporating as much of the network structure just sort of the average. Now I'm keeping track again of the different degrees. So I have, instead of, 3 equation for the online, which is what we see here, we have 3 times K, which was, capital K, which was the average degree. We can also do a pairwise approximation looking at, the evolution of the edges. There are actually a variety of ways to approximate it. We settled on this compact way where, again, for the edges, we're not separating, we're just keeping track of the total, adding essentially over n. But the complexity of the model does increase, and we want to see whether it's worth the payoff. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples for the different types of networks that I mentioned before. Again, in the online world, you can see that the pairwise in green does significantly better than the single level approximation. And this is here on the right is the offline protesting. So again, the pairwise offers a better approximation, especially online. For the bimodal network, actually online, both of them do quite well. Both of them do quite well. And of course, this is also a function of the density of the network. Here we have basically half of the nodes have an average degree of 30, half of the nodes have an average degree of 70. And then offline, this is what we see. And you can see the approximations are worse because in this situation, the average degrees are smaller. So in general, the approximations are better for denser networks. This is a power law network. This is a situation where our parameters lead to no epidemic or no action. In this case, actually, the single level does well, but as soon as there is some action, the pairwise actually always does better in general. So we also tested this on a couple of Facebook friendship networks. And for situations where there's no activity, or we don't expect an outburst, both of the models do basically exactly the same. But whenever there is an outburst, our matches are no longer as good as in the synthetic networks. And the improvement that we get for the pairwise approximation is not as dramatic as we did. You can see here it's an improvement, but not significant. And so we think that the thing that we need to incorporate is sort of like the clustering. There's probably clustering that's happening within the network that requires maybe a better approximation for this particular fit. But nevertheless, we can determine when we expect an outburst of activity from the differential equation, not having to run 5,000 stochastic simulations. We also wanted to analyze sort of the network effect on the maximum size of activity. You can also do it on the total size of activity. What we see is, interestingly, is that, of course, as again, the average degree increases, you of course see an increase in the max activity, but it plateaus. And most importantly, offline, in reality, the online activity is kind of important, but really what has a huge effect is the offline activity, right? If offline people are protesting, boycotting, or even rioting, that's where the damage is being caused. And so that plateaus very quickly. So after about an average degree of 20, in essence, the activity remains the same, right? So that's something that was a bit unexpected from when we started to model this. Okay, so what are the benefits, right? Is that we can, by looking at a mean field model, is that we can try to approximate the reproductive number based on the type of approximation that we have. This is just an example from the fully connected network. And in essence, this is initially, I'm just engaging people online. This is a fraction of people engaged. And I'm looking at the max level of activity. And basically this axis is online. So this is the online engagement, and the x-axis is going to be this R naught. So whenever it crosses 1, you begin to see some activity, and the same thing for offline activity. Of course, it does much better approximating when you have a small perturbation. So for example, green versus red when, let's say, the fraction is 0.1, because it's no longer a small perturbation of what's happening. So this is the offline activity. So we want to sort of take advantage of the mean field models that we have to try to understand when we expect to have a protest offline or not. And so let me just compare these the analytical are not compared to the stochastic simulations. So these are Gillespie, right? So these are stochastic simulations of our Markov process. And in fact, for the online, we see that below here, we don't see an outburst, and above our analytical are not, we begin to see sort of activity. And of course, as tau increases and gamma I decreases, we see more and more activity. The same sort of happens for the offline activity, except you do see not as clear of a transition as you do for the online here in the offline activity. If you compare it, of course, to like the actual simulations for the single level approximation, then you get an exact fit, where again, here we're looking at the max engagement, which happens to be, well, the initial condition would be the max engagement here, and then here it begins to grow, as we would expect based on these parameters. You can do the same thing for the pairwise approximation. And of course, you get a different R naught value. And the line here, I'm showing it here. The expression is a lot more complicated, but you can again obtain this line. And so you can predict that if you're above, you're in this region, you'd expect an outburst, versus below this region, you would expect that no activity will happen. So you can study what happens, right, the effect of the density of the network has. And so what happens for our R naught, both in from the single level approximation and from the homogeneous pair approximation, is that as we move down, we're increasing K. So essentially, you're predicting more and more possibility of outburst as the density of the network increases, which makes sense. But you can see here the difference between the R naught predicted by the single level and the pairwise approximation. So, from the practical perspective, you wanna see whether you can predict whether an outburst is going to happen again offline. Not so much caring about sort of the activity that happens online, because people can sort of release their tension there without, as much consequences. And it depends on the threshold of what you mean by what is an outburst, right? So pink here is the analytic homogeneous pairwise. Black here is you can approximate the stochastic R naught from this black line. And orange would mean we're predicting an outburst if the threshold is low for what we call an outburst. Now, as we increase the threshold, of course, then our analytic R naught begins to do better. And if you increase the threshold sufficiently large, which basically we found an article on NPR talking about sort of what typically is considered to be a threshold for a protest. And then we're kind of over predicting what's going to be a protest, but the stochastic R naught does an even worse job predicting, right? Like it over predicts a lot more than the analytic homogeneous pairwise. So really, depending on what your threshold is, you may want to use a different R naught. Okay, so in terms of classifying, we wanted to see the effects of different parameters that are not so obvious, right? So I think when you're on the online layer, you understand the effect that tau versus gamma I, right? So tau is an infection rate, and then there's a recovery rate. But there's some monotonic behavior that we observe as we sort of play around with the thresholds of determining whether something is a protest of not or not. So let's just look at here where the threshold is 0.3. You can see this non-monotonic behavior. So for a given gamma p, so that is the recovery rate offline, you can see that essentially there's like a sweet spot for eta, which is the transmission rate between online and offline, for there to be an outburst of activity. And essentially, why that's happening is that even though eta is a transmission rate, right? So clearly, if eta is 0, you expect no protesting activity offline. If eta is small and it's smaller than gamma p, you will not see an outburst. So it has to be sufficiently large so that you have people protesting. But if eta is too large, essentially what you're doing is that you're depleting your reservoir of people who can protest, right? And so that's why we see this non-monotonic behavior, where in fact you need sort of this sweet spot of transmission rates between online and offline to actually see protesting activity. If eta is too large, you're going to be depleting things too quickly, so you eventually will not get a significant outburst of activity. Okay, so where we are essentially now, where we basically have the models that we understand for what networks we should be using, and we do have data from Twitter data and ACLID data. So ACLID is an organization that keeps track of newspapers, basically newspaper articles of different conflicts, all types of conflicts. It is difficult to put those things together. So initially what we're doing is basically generating synthetic data using LLM, so generating tweets based on a given network to try to determine how identifiable the model is and how identifiable the network structure is before we actually move on to like work with the real data. And the data we have is actually from the Philippines. So we're working our way there. So that's sort of where we are with this project. So I wanted to change gears to talk about sort of things that are more closer to the type of work that I typically do, which are sort of like, okay, we have this reaction diffusion equations. How can we incorporate network structure, and what can we learn about the spread of activity on this network structure? And so I want to start off with the model that we introduced back in 2015, maybe 2016. Where you have basically the evolution of the level of activity. And here, think about offline activity and think of you as sort of the conditional expectation of a Poisson process, right? And it's evolving also depending on sort of the social tension, because we know that for activity to happen, you not only need a triggering event, which in our case would be an initial condition, but there needs to be sort of social tension. And so this model was developed by, we talked to people, to someone who's like a specialist in protesting activity, but also the quotes here are actually quotes taken from people who partook in the 2005 French riots. And all these basically appear in our term. Let me just tell you the reaction term, right? For the reaction term, we have this sort of switch mechanism where if the tension is low, there will be no action. So it has to be sufficiently large for the self-excitement to turn on. This is the self-excitement, your growth up to a carrying capacity, because there's only so many people that can protest. And then there's a coupling, which is very interesting on its own. And typically I talk about sort of the effect of this parameter K naught. I will briefly talk about it, but it's not really the focus of today's talk. So this is a model that we have offline. And I guess, 2015 is when we published it. So this was sort of motivated by it's always fun to see the data of actually the protesting activity. In this case, it was a rioting activity throughout the country. But if you kind of divide it into spatial locations, you can see that there's this traveling wave-like phenomena where the peak, it's not the exact same peak, so it's not truly a traveling wave, but the peak, actually, the peak of activity is happening later. The further away it's happening distance-wise from the initial triggering point, which was here in department 93. And so we wanted to make sure, of course, that our model did allow for traveling wave solutions. And in fact, depending on the parameter K naught, we do have traveling wave solutions that look very differently. Either they're monotone, right? So in this case, blue is activity, red is tension. And so you have high activity invading, high tension invading, or you have situations where you have activity invading, leaving behind a lower level of activity and also a lower level of tension, which is closer to what you observe here in the data. So we want to see what happens when we move this model to a network, right? So now diffusion, instead of happening offline, it's happening on a network. So the diffusion of these is happening via the graph Laplacian. And so this is a picture of a 5-area tree. So this is a tree that has, 5 leaves, and you're just seeing a shell, right? So you could look at shells. You could look at you have a parent node, and anything that's distance 1 would be shell 1. Anything that's distance 2 would be shell 2. And with symmetric initial conditions, we expect symmetric dynamics. And so we're just seeing one branch here. And one of the, each one is a different shell. And so here we initialize that white is high level of activity. And you can see that that's moving throughout the network like a traveling wave, like solution, a traveling solution, right? So this is a way to visualize these traveling wave solutions on this type of networks. So the kinetics in our model, of course, influence what we expect to see and the types of solutions that we obtain and the speed of invasion, right? So for us, we have a system of equations. So this isn't exactly the kinetics, but more or less we have a situation where we have a strong Ali effect, a small parameter regime, but nevertheless, we have a parameter regime. We have the so-called weak Ali effect, and we also have a Fisher KPP depending on the parameters, right? And so we want to analyze what happens in each of these 3 regimes to the speed of the traveling wave, for example. And so just to give you an idea, right, these are the equilibrium solutions for U that I'm illustrating as a function of K naught, where I have fixed all the other parameters. And you can see that there's a situation also where there's only one fixed point, and then 3 fixed points, and then eventually the bottom fixed point converges to the 0. It's easier to see if you change gamma, right? So again, depending on where we are on this parameter gamma, we're either going to have one fixed point, which we're not going to worry about that. Then we enter the strong Ali effect, and then eventually the weak Ali effect, and then the Fisher KPP regime. So let's focus, I don't know what I did. Let's focus on the Fisher KPP regime, right? So in this regime, actually, you expect to obtain, and actually from the study of the system in the physical space, you expect to have pooled waves. In such a case, the spreading speed, we expect to be the linearized spreading speed. So linearized about the equilibrium where there's no action. And that's what we see here. You can do some asymptotic. So all of this work really is asymptotic analysis. So we're going to be looking at the diffusion limits in general, but we can figure out what the spreading speed is. And you can see here that you need essentially the effect of the self-excitement to be sufficiently large compared to the relaxation rate. And then the diffusion, of course, increases D1 very large. What we see here is sort of numerical simulations for as a function of K naught, where you can see for different diffusion rates D2 that in fact we do have a linearized spreading speed. So the black line represents the linearized spreading speed, and the dots represent our simulations. Eventually it diverges because we are leaving the Fisher KPP regime. So we're leaving the pooled regime and entering the so-called pushed regime, which we'll eventually want to understand a little bit better. But for now, you can see that in, here we're changing also our diffusion coefficient, and you can see that our approximate spreading speed matches our numerical simulations quite well. The one thing that I wanted to mention that I think it's interesting that's different from physical space is that the tree, the dynamics actually do change significantly. So what we see here on the bottom left is the spreading speed as a function of a diffusion for different values of R, right? So remember, R is sort of like the different branches. And so what we see is that for each R, we have actually a maximum diffusion, right? A diffusion that maximizes the speed. And in fact, if the diffusion is too large, actually we will have no traveling wave because the diffusion happens so quickly that the reaction term can't keep up with the depletion due to diffusion. And so this is in contrast to what we see in physical space. And as R increases, this diffusion gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it seems to be approaching this line here. So, but we haven't figured out, we haven't done we haven't taken this limit here yet. So we understand sort of the region, right? We know what the spreading speed is if you happen to be in the Fisher KPP regime. And as you're moving here, you're moving towards sort of this weak Ali effect here. And so we wanted to analyze that. And to do that, actually, we had to move to like a binary tree. So essentially, this is kind of a discrete, right? So everybody has two neighbors. And in such a case, well, you can approximate the system actually in the large D1 limit with a PDE in continuous space. And so then you can use what you know about the PDE to analyze what happens on the network. What we see here in the top right is the spreading speed. And you can see as D gets larger, right? Your error between our PDE and our discrete system actually like decreases. But we can then try to understand where we expect to see the transition between the Fisher KPP and the weak Ali effect as a function of time. And the lines are actually the simulations, right? So we're estimating a little bit, a transition a little bit early on. But what we can do then is try to understand the spreading speed that happens along this transition. And so asymptotically, the speed that we get is basically given by this orange line. And as our diffusion gets smaller, actually our approximation gets better. Okay, so we at least have some approximation of what that spreading speed is as we transition between this pooled regime to the pushed regime. So that's basically looking into the Fisher KPP and looking into the weak Ali effect. What happens in that third regime where we have three, right, the strong Ali effect? Well, in this situation, we can have actually pinned waves or actually retreating or invading waves. And I'm going to show you the three situations. So in this case, I want to show you what I mean by these waves on an Erdos-Raynaud random network. So this is not a tree anymore. This is a random network. But nevertheless, I can take a node to be a parent, and I can define the first shell to be anything that's distance 1 and shell 2 anything that's distance 2, and shell 3 anything that's distance 3. And so we see 2 different types of waves. The first wave, are called the waves of the first kind, where essentially you activate the core of your traveling wave. And so that's what we see here. This is basically the parent node, anything within distance 1, and we're activating anything up to distance 3. So red is actually our initial condition. And then you can see the different colors, but there's purple and green right underneath the blue here. So what we see is that we let the system evolve, and the system gets stuck in this traveling wave solution in blue. That's so-called pin wave, right? It's not evolving in time anymore. If I change the parameters a little bit, you start off with the same initial conditions, and you begin to see actually movement down. This is a retreating wave, and eventually everything will go down to 0, right? So this is a pin wave, this is a retreating wave. So these are the types of waves that you observe in this third regime of the Fisher, the strong Ali effect. The waves of a second kind are waves where I choose a parent node, but I'm going to activate things in the outer layer, right? In the periphery as defined by my parent node. So in this case, I'm activating nodes that are, distance 7 and 6 away from my node. And again, we see this pin wave in this situation. But if I change the parameters, we now see an invading wave, and everything's going to go to the active state. So we want to understand, when do we have these pin waves? When do we have an invading wave? When do we have a retreating wave? And so again, all of this is kind of using asymptotics. So we take sort of large and small diffusion limits. But if we take a large diffusion limit in V, we can approximate our equation by, this single equation, and F has a very particular form. I'm making the assumption that I'm in the situation where F has 3 roots. 0 is one of them, and then R2 and R3 being the largest. And so if you are in a network tree of branching factors, so now I'm going to do the analysis not for the Erdos-Régnier, but for a tree, which kind of approximate the Erdos-Régnier locally. Let's say the branching factor is K-1. We can really consider the dynamics at each shell. And the equation is not that complicated, is what we see down here. And if you're assuming that your diffusion is very small, that means your transition or your wavefront is actually very, very thin. So you can make the approximation that your front is in layer M. And if it's a wave of the first kind, you're assuming that everything in shells less than M are in state R3, the active state, and anything after is in 0, right? Like it's already in the relaxed state because it's a very, very thin front. And so what that allows us to do is basically reduce trying to find these pin waves to finding zeros of this equation here, where we have a condition that because K is sufficiently large and U is close to R3, then this is actually negative. So we need F of UM to be positive. And so that tells me something about the root has to be bigger than R2 for there to be a pin wave. And so you can do the same thing, by the way, for waves of the second kind. Here I'm just sort of showing you the roots of G. So for the waves of the first kind as a function of the parameters. And so really what you want is sort of, roots that are going to be sufficiently large, right? And that's going to be depending on the function as a function of K and also your diffusion as well. But basically what this allows us to do, what this analysis allows us to do, is it allows us to separate our space into regions where we expect to find waves of the first kind, waves of the second, or pin waves, invading waves, retreating waves. And so really I'm separating this parameter space into 4 regions. And I just want to illustrate, for example, these are the roots of G for different parameters that live in either space 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you can see that essentially, basically, the blue, purple, and green curve actually do have roots that are sufficiently large. So we expect pin waves in regions 1, 2, and 3. But we do not expect pin waves in region 4. So in this case, we expect actually a retreating wave. You can do the same thing for waves of the second kind. In such a case, you want roots smaller than U2 or R2, and really only the green region, so only region 1 will give us pin waves. Everything else actually will be an invading wave. And that's exactly what we see. So these are numerical simulations in our tree network. And as I promised, right, for the waves of the first kind, in regions 1, 2, and 3, we in fact see pinned waves. So the green actually is the final wave as like t approaches infinity. But you can see in region 4, actually, we have a retreating wave. We have no activity left. For the waves of the second kind, we see now pin waves only in region 1, as I promised, and then invading waves in regions 2, 3, and 4. So now we have a much better understanding of for what parameter regimes do we expect certain types of waves. In this case, actually, whenever you have an invading wave, it's a pushed wave. So you can find the spreading speed using a linearized using the linearized equation. So we don't have the spreading speed in this particular case. So with that, let me conclude that essentially we have developed frameworks to model and study online to offline activity using one epidemic models, right? We develop single and pairwise approximations for homogeneous and heterogeneous networks. We saw that the density of the network plays a key role in which approximation to use more efficiently. We saw some interesting behavior that's not seen in just if you just were to look at one layer. There is no non-monotonic behavior between the parameters. And so this transition between an online to offline world leads to some interesting behavior in the dynamics. And from the reaction diffusion perspective, right, the different parameters, so we need to understand the different parameters to see whether we're going to be expecting pulled waves, push waves, or pinned waves, right, depending on the parameter regime. And we developed approximations for the spreading speeds in the situation where you're in the pulled wave or in the transition between the pull to push as you're crossing from the Fisher KPP to the weak Ali effect. And with this, let me thank the NSF and AFOSR for their funding. We thankfully still have this funding at least for a year, more. And really, my student William and my postdoc Moi for the work. And thank you all for your attention.